Grant Holloway thought the $50 price tag for the remote Montana cabin was the perfect escape from his past. He was wrong. It was a trap. The moment they stepped into the clearing, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. Koda, his battle-hardened German shepherd, didn't run to explore the trees. Instead, the dog froze, his hackles rising in a ridge of dark fur. He wasn't looking at the crumbling timber walls shown in the listing. He was fixated on the ground beneath the porch. Koda let out a low, vibrating growl, a specific signal Grant hadn't heard since his days in the Rangers. It wasn't a reaction to a squirrel or a deer. It was the signal for human threat. Grant realized the town hadn't warned him away because of ghosts or bad luck. They were terrified of what was breathing beneath the floorboards. Grant had come here to bury his demons, but he was about to discover that some secrets refused to stay underground. And what Koda found in the dirt would force Grant to pick up his rifle one last time. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The air in the Timber Falls Realty office was stagnant, smelling of stale toner, dust, and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. It was the scent of desperation, something Grant Holloway recognized instantly. He sat on a cheap plastic chair, a figure of silent intensity that seemed too large for the cramped room. He wore the uniform of a man trying to fade into the background, a worn brown Carhartt jacket, faded jeans, and a cap pulled low over eyes that were constantly scanning for threats. At his feet lay Koda, a sable German shepherd with a coat the color of storm clouds and smoke. The dog didn't sleep. He watched the door with an amber gaze that missed nothing. Across the desk, Carol Finch, the real estate agent, wasn't trying to make a sale. She was trying to unload a burden. $50, she said, her voice tight. She didn't make eye contact. She stared at the paperwork as if looking at it too long might burn her. 50, Grant confirmed, his voice rough from disuse. There was no haggling. No mention of inspections. In any other town, a 160-acre property with a standing log cabin, even a dilapidated one, would have triggered a bidding war. Here the listing sat on the desk like a contagious disease. As is, where is, Carol recited, pushing the deed across the Formica surface. Her hand trembled slightly. The county just wants the tax liability off the books. It's been empty for years. She was lying. Not about the vacancy but about the reason. Grant could see the pulse jumping in her neck. She handed him the keys with a speed that bordered on panic, her relief palpable the moment the metal touched his palm. Grant stood up, his movements economical and precise. He didn't ask about the bad luck she had muttered about earlier. He didn't care about local superstitions. He just wanted the silence. But as he pushed open the glass door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the silence of Timber Falls felt heavy. Conversations died instantly. A group of men near a pickup truck turned their backs, but he could feel their eyes boring into his shoulder blades. An old rancher, skin weathered like leather, was the only one who didn't look away. He stopped Grant as he moved toward his truck, blocking his path with a grim expression. "You're the one," the rancher said. It wasn't a question. "You bought the Kruger place." Grant nodded once. "I did." The rancher looked at Koda, then back at Grant, his expression shifting from curiosity to deep, genuine pity. He shook his head slowly. "Then you're a braver man than me, son. Or a much more foolish one." Grant didn't reply. He whistled for Koda, climbed into his truck and turned the ignition. He told himself he was driving toward peace. As the town faded in his rearview mirror and the dense pines swallowed the road, he had no idea he was driving straight into a war zone. The engine of the aging Silverado ticked as it cooled in the crisp Montana air, a rhythmic metal heartbeat in the silence of the afternoon. Grant Holloway sat behind the wheel, staring at the screen of his phone until the backlight dimmed and flickered out. He tapped it awake again, rereading the words that had brought him 2,000 miles across the country. Must sell. 160 acres, cabin, $50 OBO. Price reflects condition and local superstitions. $50. It was less than a tank of gas. It was the price of a mistake. Grant rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of 3 days on the road. At 38 he felt 50. The army had taken his youth, and the ambush in the Korangal Valley had taken everything else. He looked over at the passenger seat. Koda, his sable German shepherd, watched him with amber eyes that held a calm intelligence. The dog was the only thing Grant hadn't sold, donated, or thrown away. Koda was the only reason Grant hadn't put a bullet in the chamber of his Sig Sauer and finished what the Taliban started. Last stop, buddy, Grant murmured. Koda's ear twitched, acknowledging the voice, but his gaze remained on the storefront ahead. Timber Falls Realty. Grant stepped out of the truck. He moved with a stiff economy, his joints aching from the drive and the shrapnel scars that crisscrossed his left side. He adjusted his Carhartt jacket, checked the street, habit not necessity, and pushed open the door to the realty office. The office smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Carol Finch, a woman in her 40s with frizzled hair and eyes that darted like a trapped bird's, looked up from her desk. When Grant mentioned the listing, the relief that washed over her face was so intense it was almost insulting. The cabin. Right. Yes, she said, talking too fast, her hands fluttering over stacks of paper. It's a steal. Absolute steal. Just needs a little TLC. A handyman's dream. She pulled a file from a drawer. It was suspiciously thin. No inspections, no disclosures, just a blurry photocopy of a deed and a map that looked hand-drawn. Why $50? Grant asked. His voice was gravelly and used to long conversations. He fixed her with a dark stare that usually made people look away. Carol didn't disappoint. She focused on his collarbone. Like the ad said, it's remote. And there's been talk. Local gossip. Superstitious nonsense, really? She laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the middle. The previous owner abandoned it years ago. Reverted to the county for back taxes. They just want the liability off the books. What kind of liability? Just emptiness, she waved a hand dismissively. It's been sitting there rotting. People think it's unlucky. Bad history. What history? She froze for a fraction of a second, then shoved a pen toward him. Mr. Holloway, do you want the property or not? I have 3 other showings today. She didn't have 3 other showings. The office was as dead as the phone on her desk. Grant looked at the map, then at the keys sitting on the blotter. He didn't care about ghosts. He didn't care about bad luck. He cared that for $50 he could buy a place where no one would ask him where he served or why he was the only one who came back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $50 bill, then added another. For the filing fees. Carol snatched the money and practically threw the keys at him. Sold. As is. Where is? No refunds. Grant signed the papers. The ink was barely dry before she was ushering him toward the door, her anxiety spiking as if she feared he might change his mind. He walked back out into the cold sunlight, the deed folded in his pocket. The town of Timber Falls felt heavy. It wasn't just the mountain shadows stretching across the main street, it was the way the air seemed to thicken around him. A rancher was leaning against a post near Grant's truck, a man in his 60s with skin like cured leather and a Stetson pulled low. He didn't move as Grant approached. You just bought the Kruger place, didn't you? The man said. His voice was a low rumble. Grant paused, hand on the truck door. I did. The rancher looked him up and down, taking in the military bearing, the scars, the dog waiting inside the cab. His expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, unsettling pity mixed with fear. Then you're a braver man than anyone in this county, the rancher said softly. Or a more foolish one. It's just land, Grant said. The rancher shook his head, pushing off the post. Ain't nothing just land out here, son. Especially not that patch. He walked away before Grant could ask who Kruger was or why the name sounded like a curse. Grant needed coffee and supplies before the drive up. He stopped at the local diner, a place with fogged windows and the smell of frying bacon. He ordered a black coffee and a sandwich to go. The waitress, a young girl with bright braces, smiled as she wrote down the order. Heading up to the lake? She asked pleasantly. No, Grant said. Bought the cabin up on Old Miller Road. Past the ridge. The spoon the cook was using dropped onto the grill with a clatter. The diner went silent. The conversational hum died instantly. The waitress stopped writing, her smile vanishing. She ripped the ticket off the pad and slapped it on the counter. To go, she said, her voice flat. She backed away, wiping her hands on her apron as if she'd touched something contagious. A man 2 stools down threw a $5 bill on the counter, leaving a half-eaten burger, and walked out without looking back. Grant watched him go. He'd seen this behavior before. In villages in Afghanistan, right before an IED went off. It wasn't superstition. It was terror. These people weren't afraid of a haunted house. They were afraid of something real. Grant took his coffee, left a tip that was too large, and walked out. The drive out of town was a slow ascension into isolation. He took Highway 89 until the pavement ended, turning onto a gravel road that wound higher into the timberline. The gravel eventually gave way to a dirt track, rutted and overgrown, clawing its way up the mountainside. Dense pine forests closed in on both sides, blocking out the sun. The air grew colder. Grant's mind, trained to assess threats, began to map the terrain automatically. Choke point there. High ground there. No cover on the left flank. It was a habit he couldn't break, a way of seeing the world that kept him alive and kept him alone. He almost missed the turn. A half-fallen mailbox, riddled with bullet holes and marked with a faded, peeling K, leaned drunkenly into the brush. Grant turned the truck onto the driveway. Branches scraped against the doors like skeletal fingers. It hadn't been driven in years. Then the trees broke. The cabin sat in a small clearing backed by a sheer granite cliff face. It was rough-hewn timber, single-story, with a metal roof that had rusted to a dull orange. A stone chimney climbed up the side, massive and solid. The porch wrapped around three sides, sagging slightly in the middle, but the structure itself, it had bones. It was standing. It was solid. Grant killed the engine. The silence rushed in to fill the space, absolute and profound. No traffic. No sirens. No voices. "We're home, Koda," Grant whispered. For the first time in 3 years, a small, fragile spark of hope ignited in his chest. This place was broken just like him. Maybe they could put each other back together. He opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. "Okay, boy. Out." Koda leaped from the cab, landing with a heavy thud. Grant reached into the truck bed for his gear, expecting the dog to run the perimeter, to mark the trees, to do what dogs do. But there was no sound of movement. Grant turned around. Koda was standing 10 feet away, frozen. The dog's body was a rigid line of tension. His ears were pinned forward, his tail low and stiff. The fur along his spine, his hackles, stood up in a jagged ridge. He wasn't looking at the forest. He wasn't looking at the cabin door. He was staring intently at the dark, open space beneath the porch. Grant felt the hair on his own arms stand up. He knew that stance. He had seen it in the dust of Kandahar and the mud of the Pesh Valley. It wasn't curiosity. It was the specific, trained alert for a hidden threat. "Koda?" Grant said softly, his hand instinctively dropping to his hip, reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. "What is it?" The dog didn't look at him. A low, vibrating growl started deep in Koda's chest, a sound that wasn't directed at a squirrel or a deer. Koda took a step backward, placing his body between Grant and the cabin. The wind shifted, blowing from the cabin toward them. Koda's nose worked the air furiously, and then he let out a sharp, warning bark that echoed off the granite cliff. Grant looked at the silent cabin. It looked empty. It looked abandoned. But his dog was telling him that the $50 hadn't bought him solitude. It had bought him something else entirely. Something that was waiting for them under the rotting floorboards, and it was waiting to breathe. Grant forced his boots onto the rotting wood of the porch steps, the groan of the timber loud in the stillness. Koda remained at the bottom, a low whine vibrating in his throat, but Grant whistled sharply. "Forward," he commanded. It wasn't a request. The dog obeyed, moving low to the ground, muscles coiled like steel cables, scanning the perimeter with a frantic intensity that made the hair on Grant's arms stand up. Grant pushed the front door open. It swung inward on rusted hinges with a shriek that sounded like a dying animal. The interior was a single large room, swallowed by shadows. The air was stale, tasting of mouse droppings and ancient wood smoke. A shaft of late afternoon light cut through the grime of a window, illuminating an ocean of dust motes. To a civilian it was just an abandoned shack. A table, 2 overturned chairs, a metal bed frame stripped bare, and a massive stone fireplace dominating the far wall. But Grant didn't look with civilian eyes. He looked with the eyes of a man who had spent a decade hunting insurgents in the Hindu Kush. He stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the floor. The dust was thick, a gray blanket that should have been uniform. It wasn't. Near the fireplace the layer was thinner, the patterns chaotic. Someone had swept it recently, trying to feather the edges to make it look natural, but they had been sloppy. Grant moved to the window. In the corner of the sill, half buried in a spider web, was a splash of bright color. He picked it up. A wrapper for a protein bar. He turned it over, checking the small print. Best Buy, November 2026. Fresh. Someone had eaten this within the last 2 months. He crouched, checking the floor near the wall. A boot print, partial but distinct, pressed into the grime. A heavy lug sole, military or tactical, not the cowboy boots of the local ranchers. Why the charade? Grant whispered to the empty room. If squatters were living here, there would be trash, bedrolls, evidence of life. This was different. This was a stage set, designed to look abandoned while being actively visited. Night fell fast in the mountains. Grant set up his sleeping bag in the corner furthest from the windows, a tactical habit he couldn't break. He tried to settle, listening to the wind pick up outside, but Koda wouldn't lay down. The shepherd paced the room, his nails clicking on the wood. He kept returning to the hearth, staring at the floorboards with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He wasn't growling anymore. He was focused, rigid. "Koda down," Grant said. The dog ignored him. He sniffed a specific seam in the wood, then looked back at Grant, his amber eyes wide and urgent. It was the look he gave when he found an IED wire buried in the dirt. Grant threw off his sleeping bag and grabbed his flashlight. "Search," he said, giving the release command. Koda didn't hesitate. He went straight to the stone foundation of the fireplace, circled once, and then sat. He stared at the floor, his body frozen. The passive alert. "I found it." Grant knelt beside the dog. "Good boy." He ran his hand over the floorboards. They looked identical to the rest of the cabin, rough-hewn pine, stained dark with age. But when he pressed his weight on the board directly in front of the hearth, there was no creak. It felt solid, too solid. He pulled his K-bar knife from his belt and jammed the blade into the gap between the boards. He pried upward. The wood didn't splinter. Instead, a 3-foot square section of the floor lifted as a single unit. It was a false panel, wood glued onto a steel frame. Beneath it wasn't dirt. It was a recessed metal hatch, painted a matte gray to blend with the shadows. It wasn't antique. There was no rust on the heavy-duty hinges, and the recessed handle was modern, industrial grade. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a root cellar. He gripped the handle and twisted. It turned smoothly, well-oiled. He pulled. With a pneumatic hiss that sounded violently loud in the quiet cabin, the seal broke. The hatch rose on hydraulic struts. A metal ladder descended into a square of absolute blackness. "Stay," Grant ordered. Koda whined a high-pitched protest, but held his position at the lip of the hole. Grant clicked his tactical light on and descended. The air grew colder as he climbed down the 15 feet of steel rungs, the smell of dust replaced by something sharper, cleaner, chemical. His boots hit concrete. He swept the beam around. He was standing in a bunker, maybe 20 by 30 feet. The walls were cold concrete, still bearing the faded yellow and black civil defense signs from the 1960s. Fallout shelter capacity 10. But the Cold War relics were just the shell. Grant's light caught a strip of LED lights running along the ceiling, currently dark. A modern ventilation system hummed almost imperceptibly in the corner, scrubbing the air. He swung the beam to the left. Metal shelving units were stocked with military precision, water, MREs, blankets. He swung the beam to the right and the breath hitched in his throat. 4 mattresses lay on the concrete floor. They weren't stored there, they were laid out for use. And bolted into the concrete wall above each mattress were heavy-duty metal rings. Attached to the rings were industrial zip ties and steel handcuffs. Grant moved forward, his boots silent on the concrete. This wasn't a prepper's hideout. He shone the light into the corner. A medical station. Not just bandages but sedatives, syringes for bags, and a box of latex gloves. On a folding table in the center of the room sat a logbook and a roll of duct tape. Grant approached it, his hand trembling slightly as he opened the book. It was filled with coded entries. Alpha 7. Arrival, 10/24. Departure, October 26th. Cond, good. Bravo 3. Arrival, November 2nd. Departure, 11/04. Cond, sedated. The most recent entry was 5 days ago. Grant looked at the wall above the mattresses. Scratched into the concrete, likely with a rock or a fingernail, were drawings. Crude stick figures holding hands. A house with a sun. And words, etched frantically into the gray stone. Mama. Uda. Mama. He stepped back, his boot crunching on something small. He shone the light down. A plastic hair clip. Bright pink, shaped like a butterfly. Grant picked it up. It was clean. No dust. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The cheap price. The town's terror. The bad luck. It wasn't ghosts. It was a way station. A processing center for human beings moving along a pipeline that stretched God knew how far. They were bringing people here, children, drugging them, holding them, and moving them on. And they had been here 5 days ago. Suddenly, Koda began to bark. Not the investigative bark from earlier, but the deep, booming alarm bark that signaled an imminent breach. Grant shoved the hair clip into his pocket and scrambled up the ladder, his muscles burning with adrenaline. He vaulted out of the hatch and looked toward the window. Through the trees, twin beams of light cut through the darkness. Headlights. A vehicle was moving slowly up the overgrown driveway. A heavy diesel engine rattled the glass in the window frames. It was nearly 11 at night. No one came up this road by accident. Grant watched as a black heavy-duty pickup truck rolled into the clearing and killed its lights. The engine silenced, but the doors didn't open immediately. They were assessing. Grant looked at his phone. No service. He looked at the hatch, wide open in the middle of the floor. He couldn't close it and hide the cut floorboards in time. If they came in, they would know he found it. They would know the operation was compromised. Grant Holloway had spent 3 years trying to run away from violence, trying to find a place where he didn't have to be a soldier. But as he listened to the heavy thud of truck doors closing outside and the murmur of men's voices, he realized the war had found him. "Koda, quiet," he hissed. "Come." He grabbed his rifle case, not having time to unlock it, and moved to the back door. He didn't know how many of them were out there or what they were armed with. He only knew that if he stayed in this box, he died in this box. He slipped the latch on the back door and eased it open, ghosting into the freezing night just as the front door of the cabin shattered inward with a violent kick. Grant and Koda sprinted into the tree-line, diving into the cover of the dense underbrush. He pressed himself into the frozen earth, watching the cabin. Flashlight beams danced inside the windows. "Clear left," a voice shouted. "Hatch is open," another voice yelled, tight with anger. He found the hole. Grant watched as a man stepped out onto the porch, lit by the spill of light from inside. He was holding a radio. "Boss," the man said, his voice carrying over the wind. "We have a problem. The stray dog found the bone." "Yeah. No. He's gone. But he can't have gone far." The man turned, scanning the dark forest where Grant lay hidden, his eyes seeming to bore straight through the brush. He unholstered a pistol and racked the slide. "Find him," the man commanded the darkness. "And bury him." The underbrush was freezing, the kind of cold that seeped through denim and settled into the bone, but Grant didn't move. He lay prone in the dense thicket 50 yards from the cabin, Koda pressed tight against his side. The dog's breathing was shallow and silent, a testament to his training. Below them, the heavy-duty truck sat idling in the clearing, its exhaust puffing gray clouds into the night air. 2 men had exited. The first was the driver, a man in his early 50s with the heavy set of a wrestler and the confident, claiming stride of an owner. He wore a shearling coat and moved with a purpose that made Grant's grip tighten on the forest floor. This was Dale Kruger. The second man was younger, thin, and twitchy. He kept glancing at the tree line, his hand hovering near the waistband of his jeans. When his jacket shifted, the moonlight caught the dull gleam of a holstered pistol. They didn't knock. Kruger produced a key, unlocked the front door, and kicked it open. Grant watched through the uncurtained windows as the beams of their tactical flashlights slashed through the darkness of the cabin. They swept left, then right. Then they stopped. Both beams converged on the floor near the fireplace. Grant held his breath. He hadn't had time to close the hatch or replace the false floorboards. Kruger's body language shifted instantly. The casual arrogance vanished, replaced by a rigid, predatory alertness. He spun around, shouting something at the younger man, then pulled a radio from his coat pocket. Grant strained to hear, the wind carrying snatches of the conversation. "We have a problem," Kruger barked into the device. "Someone's been inside. The hole is open." Static crackled in response, unintelligible from this distance. "No idea," Kruger replied, pacing in front of the window. "Could be kids. Could be a vagrant. Or it could be our new neighbor." He paused, listening. "Yeah. The guy who bought the property. I'll check the county records." Another pause. The silence of the forest seemed to amplify the man's next words. "Understood. I'll take care of it." The phrase "take care of it" hit Grant like a physical blow. It was the sterile, bureaucratic language of murder. He had heard it 1,000 times in 1,000 different operational theaters. It meant erased. It meant gone. Kruger and the younger man vanished down the hatch. They were gone for 5 minutes, long enough to check the inventory, to see the logbook was moved, to see the dust disturbed. When they emerged, Kruger was on his cell phone this time. "Boss needs to know," he said, locking the cabin door behind him. "We might have to move the schedule up." They moved to the truck, but they didn't leave. Kruger walked a slow perimeter of the cabin, his flashlight aimed at the ground. He was tracking. Grant cursed silently. The frost was hard, but the mud underneath was soft. Kruger stopped near the back porch where Grant had exited. He crouched, examining the earth. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, then made another call. "Military-style boots," Kruger said, his voice carrying clearly now that the wind had died down. "Size 11. Deep tread. Professional spacing between the steps. He didn't run, he moved to cover. Whoever this is, he has training. The truck doors slammed shut. The engine roared, and the vehicle tore out of the clearing, tires spinning gravel as it disappeared down the mountain road. Grant waited. He checked his watch. 30 minutes. Standard protocol to ensure they weren't circling back to ambush him. His mind was racing, assembling the pieces of the puzzle into a grim picture. This wasn't a couple of rednecks running a meth lab. This was an organization with a hierarchy, a boss, a schedule, and the discipline to recognize a threat. They had his description from the realty office. Now they had his footprint. They knew exactly who he was. When the 30 minutes were up, Grant stood. His knees cracked, but his mind felt sharper than it had in years. For 3 years, the hypervigilance of his PTSD had been a curse, a noise in his head that wouldn't let him sleep or trust. Now, in the dark woods with a target on his back, that noise quieted into a focused frequency. The demon wasn't in his head anymore. It was out there in a truck driving away. He returned to the cabin. He didn't turn on the lights. He moved by memory and moonlight. Work to do, Koda, he whispered. He spent the next hour securing the perimeter. He couldn't call for help. The phone was still a useless brick. He couldn't drive down to the local police station, not after seeing the fear in the town's eyes. He needed irrefutable proof, and he needed a way to transmit it to federal authorities. He found a spool of heavy thread in his gear bag and a few empty soup cans from the previous owner's trash. He rigged a primitive early warning system across the driveway, ankle height, filled with pebbles. It was crude, but it would rattle loud enough to wake him. He slept in 4-hour shifts, fully dressed, his back to the wall, rifle across his lap. He didn't dream of the ambush in Karangao. He dreamed of the hair clip on the concrete floor. Morning brought a gray, leaden sky that promised snow. Grant drove the Silverado back into Timber Falls. He needed to gauge the enemy, and to do that, he had to rattle the cage. He parked in front of the hardware store. The bell chimed as he entered, the sound cheerful and jarring. The owner, a man named Abernathy with kind eyes and shaking hands, was behind the counter. "Morning," Grant said, placing a box of nails and a new padlock on the counter. "Morning, son," Abernathy said, avoiding his gaze. "Met the property manager last night?" Grant said casually. "Dale Kruger. Seems like he's been taking real good care of the place." The blood drained from Abernathy's face so fast he looked like he might faint. He stopped ringing up the items. His hands went still. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask what Kruger said. He just stared at the register, terrified to even acknowledge the name. That's good," the old man whispered. He shoved the receipt at Grant. "On the house. Just go." Grant left the nails. The reaction confirmed everything. Kruger wasn't just a thug, he was the boogeyman. Grant stopped at the gas station next. While the pump clicked, he walked over to the community board protected by scratched plexiglass. Amidst advertisements for firewood and snow plowing were 2 flyers that stood out. Missing. The first was a teenage girl, 16 years old. Disappeared 3 months ago. Last seen near the Canadian border crossing. The second was a young woman, 22. Vanished 2 months ago. Grant pulled out his phone and photographed them. The dates lined up with the logbook entries in the shelter. The schedule Kruger had mentioned. This was the pipeline. As he turned back to his truck, a vehicle pulled into the station, blocking his exit. It was a sheriff's department SUV, black and white, sleek and authoritative. The window rolled down. The man behind the wheel was in his 50s, with a buzz cut and eyes like chips of flint. He wore the uniform with the ease of someone who had worn one for a long time, likely military before he was law. The nameplate read Gaines. "Mr. Holloway," the sheriff said. It wasn't a question. Grant leaned against his truck, crossing his arms. "News travels fast." "Small town," Gaines said. He didn't smile. He scanned Grant's truck, his eyes lingering on Koda in the passenger seat, then moved to Grant's boots. He was checking the tread. "Heard you bought the old Kruger place. Just wanted to welcome you officially. Make sure you're settling in all right." It was an assessment, cold and clinical. "Any problems out there?" Gaines asked, his voice smooth. "Strange visitors? Anything unusual?" Grant held the sheriff's gaze. He knew exactly what this was. Gaines was fishing, trying to see if Grant had found the hatch, trying to see if he had met Kruger. "Just peace and quiet, Sheriff," Grant lied smoothly. "Exactly what I was looking for." Gaines stared at him for a long beat, the silence stretching tight between them. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. "That's good. Real good," Gaines said finally. "You seem like a man who values his privacy. I respect that." He shifted the car into drive, the engine growling. "Just remember, Mr. Holloway, out here people who mind their own business tend to live longer, happier lives." The SUV pulled away, rolling slowly down Main Street like a shark patrolling a reef. Grant watched him go, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The corruption wasn't just a property manager with a key. It wasn't just a few paid-off locals. It went to the badge. Sheriff Gaines wasn't investigating the disappearances. He was facilitating them. Grant climbed back into his truck. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone in a hostile territory where the law was the enemy and the silence was bought with blood. He put the truck in gear and headed back toward the mountain. He told himself he was going back to pack, to leave, to find a federal field office 3 states away. But as he turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, Koda sat up, staring intently into the dark tree line. Grant followed the dog's gaze. High up on a ridge overlooking his property, a glint of sunlight flashed off glass. A lens. They weren't just checking on him. They were watching him. And they were waiting for the sun to go down. Grant spread the contents of his reconnaissance across the rough-hewn table, the glow of a battery-powered lantern casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. He had the photos of the missing girls on his phone, the coordinates from the logbook scribbled on a notepad, and a topographical map of the Montana-Canada border. He traced the lines with a calloused finger. The coordinates weren't random. They formed a jagged scar running south from the border, threading through the wildest, most unpatrolled country, crossing right through his property and continuing down toward Idaho. It was a pipeline. He looked closer at the dates in the logbook images. October 2nd, November 1st, December 1st. He checked a lunar calendar on his watch. Every single date corresponded with a new moon. The darkest nights of the month. "They move in the dark," Grant murmured. Koda, resting by the fire, pricked his ears. Grant needed more. The photos he had taken were rushed, blurry with adrenaline. If he was going to take this to the feds, he needed crime scene quality evidence. He grabbed his high-intensity tactical light and descended back into the hatch. The air in the shelter felt heavier now, charged with the knowledge of what happened here. Grant moved methodically, photographing the serial numbers on the ventilation unit, the reinforced bolts on the wall restraints, the medical supplies. He moved to the mattresses. He needed to document the filth, the reality of the captivity. He kicked the corner of a stained mattress to flip it over. Something small tumbled out and hit the concrete with a soft plastic clack. Grant froze. It was a teddy bear. Not new but well-loved. The fur was matted, one eye missing, a red ribbon tied clumsily around its neck. It was small enough to be hidden in a jacket pocket. Small enough to be a child's only comfort in hell. Grant picked it up. His hands, steady enough to thread a bullet through a keyhole at 300 yards, began to shake. A rage, white-hot and blinding, flared behind his eyes. This wasn't just trafficking. This was the slaughter of innocents. Suddenly, Koda barked from the top of the ladder, a sharp, singular warning. Grant shoved the bear into his pocket and scrambled up. He found Koda at the window, staring fixedly at a spruce tree about 100 yards into the treeline. Grant raised his binoculars. There was a slight glint, barely visible against the bark. A lens. It was a trail camera, the kind hunters used to track game. But this one wasn't pointed at a deer trail. It was angled directly at the cabin's front door. Grant cursed. He moved to the back window, scanning the perimeter. He found another one near the shed and a third covering the driveway. They weren't just checking in periodically. They were watching. They had seen him come and go. They knew he had been in the shelter. The element of surprise was gone. A crackle of static broke the silence. Grant's emergency weather radio, sitting on the mantel, hissed to life with the NOAA broadcast. Winter storm warning in effect. Major system moving in from the northwest. Expect 24 to 36 inches of accumulation. Wind chills dropping to 30 below zero. Travel will be impossible for 3 to 5 days. 36 hours. That's when the hammer would fall. The storm was a double-edged sword. It would trap him here, cutting off any hope of escape, but it would also blind the enemy's cameras and cover his tracks. Night fell with the weight of a coffin lid. Grant didn't sleep. He sat in the darkened corner of the main room, his rifle resting across his knees, listening to the wind rise. Around 2 a.m. Koda lifted his head. He didn't bark. He just let out a low, vibrating growl that Grant felt in the floorboards. Then Grant heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Careful. Deliberate. The soft scratch of metal on metal as someone worked to pick into the padlock he'd installed earlier that day. Grant moved silently, positioning himself behind the heavy oak table. "Koda ready?" he whispered. The lock clicked. The door creaked open, pushing a wedge of moonlight across the floor. A silhouette stepped inside, slender, nervous. It was the kid from the night before, Kruger's subordinate. The kid took 2 steps, gun drawn but shaking. "Stop moving," Grant said, his voice coming from everywhere and nowhere, "or the next sound you hear will be the last thing you hear." The kid froze, his breath hitching in a terrified squeak. "I'm armed," Grant continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "And I'm a veteran with PTSD. That means I'm both highly trained and incredibly unstable. Take 2 steps backward." Slowly. The kid complied, stumbling back toward the doorway. I was just... Koda stepped into the shaft of moonlight, lips curled back to reveal white fangs, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat. "Tell Kruger," Grant said, stepping into the light, the rifle leveled at the kid's chest, "that if he wants this property, he'll have to buy it from me in blood. Tell your boss that the next person who comes here uninvited won't leave walking. Do you understand?" "You don't know who you're messing with," the kid stammered, backing onto the porch. "You should leave while you still can. I've already messed with worse people than your boss in places a lot less comfortable than Montana," Grant said. "Now get out." The kid scrambled off the porch, nearly tripping over his own feet, and vanished into the darkness. Grant lowered the rifle, exhaling slowly. That wasn't a victory. It was a declaration of war. They wouldn't send a nervous kid next time. They would send a hit squad. He had 24, maybe 48 hours before the storm made the roads impassable. He needed a plan. He thought of Mark Jensen, his old team leader. Mark was out of the service now, working as an investigative journalist for a paper in Billings. Mark would know what to do with the evidence. He would know how to bypass the local corruption. But Mark was 300 miles away and Grant had no signal. Leaving now meant abandoning the cabin and the pipeline. If he left, they would just scrub the site and move the operation. The girls on the posters would never be found. He had to hold the ground. Grant began to fortify. He boarded up the lower windows with scrap wood from the shed. He stockpiled firewood inside. He filled every pot and bucket with water from the pump. Then he went to work on the perimeter. Using fishing line and empty soup cans filled with pebbles, he rigged tripwires across every approach to the cabin. It was primitive Viet Cong-style defense, but in the dark and the snow it would be effective. While securing the foundation in the basement shelter, Grant noticed something odd. The concrete on the north wall was discolored, slightly lighter than the rest. He tapped it with the butt of his flashlight. Thud. He tapped a foot to the left. Thud. He tapped the center of the discolored patch. Thud. Hollow. Grant grabbed a crowbar from the tool shelf and wedged it into the seam. With a groan of rusted metal, a false panel popped loose. Behind it was a dark, narrow tunnel, distinct from the main entrance. It smelled of damp earth and stale air. He shone his light down the shaft. It ran horizontally, shored up with old timbers. This was the original emergency exit for the fallout shelter, designed to let occupants escape if the house above collapsed. He crawled through it, Koda whining nervously behind him. The tunnel ran for 50 yards and emerged into a cluster of large boulders deep in the forest, completely concealed from the cabin and the driveway. Grant sat back on his heels, breathing in the cold air. A back door. A tactical advantage. He returned to the cabin as dawn began to bleed gray light over the mountains. The snow had started, light flakes at first, drifting lazily, but the temperature was dropping like a stone. Grant stood on the porch watching the driveway. He knew the logic of the enemy. They had a shipment scheduled. The storm provided cover, but it also forced a timeline. If they were going to move people, they had to do it before the roads closed. That meant tonight. The storm would trap him here. It would trap the traffickers here. And if his gut was right, it would trap the victims here too. He looked down at Koda. The dog pressed his head against Grant's thigh, solid and warm. Grant thought about the terrified kid on the porch. He thought about the sheriff's cold eyes. He thought about the pink hair clip and the teddy bear in his pocket. His PTSD screamed at him to run, to survive, to fade away. But his moral compass, buried under layers of trauma and guilt, pointed true north. "We're not running, boy," Grant whispered, chambering a round into his rifle. "Not this time." He turned to go back inside but stopped. On the wind, faint but distinct, came the sound of an engine. Not a truck. Something smoother. An expensive SUV, tires crunching over the frozen gravel, coming up the drive hours before he expected them. The negotiations were over. The siege was about to begin. Grant woke at 0500 hours, his internal clock snapping him from a light doze to full alertness before the sun had even thought about breaching the horizon. The cabin was cold, the fire in the stove reduced to glowing embers. Koda was already at the door, his body rigid, a low whine vibrating in his throat. Grant grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. In the gray pre-dawn light he saw it, fresh tire tracks on the access road. Not the heavy tread of Kruger's truck, but something lighter. They had come in the night, silent and quick, and then they had left. "Let's go," Grant whispered. They moved out into the biting cold. Koda hit the tracks instantly, his nose working the frozen mud. But instead of following the road back toward the highway, the dog veered sharp left, plunging into the dense forest. He was tracking a scent that led away from the cabin, toward the cluster of boulders that concealed the secondary tunnel exit. Grant's grip on the rifle tightened. If the syndicate knew about the back door, his tactical advantage was zero. They moved silently through the trees, the snow beginning to drift down in earnest now. As they approached the boulder field, Koda stopped. He didn't growl. He just stared into a crevice between two massive granite slabs. Grant raised his weapon, moving in a combat crouch. "Come out," he ordered, his voice flat. Nothing moved. Then a small sob broke the silence. Grant lowered the barrel. "I'm not going to hurt you." A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a girl no older than 16 or 17. She was Hispanic, her face pale with hypothermia, wearing a thin denim jacket that offered no protection against the Montana winter. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide with a terror that Grant recognized intimately. When she saw the rifle and the dog, she tried to run, stumbling forward a few steps before her legs gave out. She collapsed into the snow. Grant slung the rifle and ran to her, Koda at his heels. "It's okay," he said, switching to a gentler tone. "I'm not with them. My name is Grant. I'm a veteran. I can help you." She looked up at him, shaking violently. Koda approached slowly, his ears back in a submissive, non-threatening posture. He nudged her hand with his wet nose. The girl froze, then slowly reached out to touch the thick fur. The contact seemed to anchor her. Grant got her back to the cabin, wrapping her in his spare wool blankets and forcing a mug of hot broth into her hands. Her name was Maria Hernandez. She was 17 from Guatemala. "We were promised jobs," she whispered, her English broken but clear. "My sister Sofia. My cousin Carlos. They said, education. America." She took a shuddering breath. "They sold us to the shepherd men." Maria explained that they had been brought to this property 3 days ago and held in the underground shelter. She had escaped during a transfer 2 nights prior, slipping away when a guard was distracted by a phone call. She had been hiding in the woods ever since, too terrified to approach the town because the other girls whispered that the police were part of it. "They said if we run to the town, the sheriff brings us back," Maria said, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "And then we are punished." Grant felt a cold rage settle in his gut. But then Maria dropped the bombshell. "There are more," she said. 7 more. Sofia and Carlos are with them. They are at another house 50 miles away. But the men said they moved them tonight." "Tonight?" Grant asked. "Before the storm," Maria nodded. "They always move people before the big snow. No witnesses. No cars on the road. They bring them here around midnight. By morning they are gone." Grant looked at his watch. It was 0800. He had 16 hours. A sickening feeling of déjà vu washed over him. The impossible choice. The kind of choice that had cost him his squad in the Korangal Valley. If he took Maria to safety now, he was abandoning 7 people, including children, to a fate worse than death. If he stayed, he was one man with a bolt-action rifle against a syndicate that owned the law. His hands started to shake. The room seemed to tilt. The crackle of the fire sounded like gunfire. "Are you okay?" Maria asked, her voice cutting through the noise in his head. Grant squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe. "I have PTSD, he said, the admission tasting like ash. "From the military. Sometimes my brain tells me I'm back in a war zone. But I'm okay. You're safe." Maria looked at him with an ancient, weary understanding. "My uncle had that. From the gangs in Guatemala. He said sometimes the memories help him survive. Because he knows what the bad men will do before they do it." Her words hit Grant like a slap. She was right. His trauma wasn't just a scar, it was an alarm system. "We have a plan," Grant said, his voice steadying. He couldn't save everyone alone. But he could disrupt the pipeline. "I'm going to take you to the highway," Grant told her. "Not the town. You're going to flag down a highway patrol officer. Not a sheriff's deputy. A state trooper." He handed her a waterproof packet. Inside were his written statement, the photos of the shelter, the coordinates, and the hair clip. If I don't call you at this number in 96 hours, Grant said, writing a burner number on her hand, you give this to the FBI field office in Great Falls. Do you understand? He handed her $500, almost all the cash he had left. For food. For a phone. What about Sophia? Maria asked, clutching the money. What about the others? I'm going to get them out, Grant promised. I'm not leaving until they're safe. The drive to the highway was a lesson in paranoia. Grant took logging roads that weren't on any map, Koda watching the rear window for tails. When they finally reached Highway 89, the snow was falling harder. Trust no one local, Grant reminded her as she stepped out of the truck. Highway patrol or federal only. Maria looked at him, shivering in the wind. Why are you helping us? You could just leave. You could be safe. Grant looked at the gray sky. Because I spent 3 years running away from everything. But some things you can't run from. Some things you have to stand and fight. Maria hugged him, a fierce, desperate embrace, and then began walking along the shoulder. Grant waited until he saw a Montana Highway Patrol cruiser slow down and pull over. He watched the trooper get out, saw Maria hand him the packet. It was done. Now the only life on the line was his. Grant drove back to the cabin with a grim finality. He had 8 hours until midnight. 8 hours until this shipment arrived. 8 hours until the war started. He spent the time turning the cabin into a kill box. He fortified the windows, checked his lines of fire, and positioned his meager supplies. He uploaded the digital files to a cloud server during a brief window of cell service on a high ridge. At 1,500 hours, a black SUV, sleek and expensive, crunched up the driveway. It wasn't the tactical team. It was management. A man in his 50s stepped out. He wore a cashmere coat and hiking boots that had never seen mud. He was flanked by 2 bodyguards who moved like pros. This was Silas Blackwood. Mr. Holloway, Blackwood called out, standing by the hood of his car. We should talk. Grant stood on the porch, rifle in the crook of his arm. Talk fast. You've been very unlucky, Blackwood said, his voice smooth and cultured. You bought a property with complications. I'm here to offer you a solution. $50,000. You leave tonight. You forget what you saw. You live your life. How many people? Grant asked. Excuse me? How many people have you trafficked through here? Blackwood sighed. I provide a service. I connect people who want to come to America with opportunities. It's a business transaction. What happens after isn't my concern. You're holding children in a concrete cell, Grant said. That's not a service. That's slavery. Blackwood's mask slipped. The corporate veneer vanished, revealing something cold and reptilian underneath. You're a veteran with PTSD living alone in the woods. If you disappear during a blizzard, no one will ask questions. Take the money, Mr. Holloway. Don't be a martyr. I appreciate the offer, Grant said. But I'm staying. Then you're choosing to die, Blackwood said flatly. The people I work with don't leave witnesses. I've been trained by the U.S. Army to survive behind enemy lines with nothing but a knife and a bad attitude, Grant replied. You sent a kid to scare me last night. I'm not worried about your people. Blackwood's jaw tightened. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This operation has protection at every level. Sheriff, county, state. You are one broken man against an army. Yeah, Grant said. But I'm a man with nothing to lose. And you're about to find out exactly what that means. Blackwood got back in his car. You'll regret this. Grant watched the SUV disappear into the swirling snow. The negotiations were over. He sat on the porch step as evening fell. The temperature plummeted. The snow was coming down in sheets now, erasing the world, erasing the road, erasing everything but the cabin and the coming fight. Koda came out and rested his heavy head on Grant's knee. Grant ran his hand over the dog's soft ears. For the first time in 3 years, the noise in his head was gone. The guilt, the shame, the confusion, it was all silent. He had a mission. He had a squad of one. And he had something worth dying for. You ready for this, boy? Grant whispered. Koda thumped his tail once against the porch floor. Grant checked his watch. 6 hours until midnight. He stood up and walked back inside, locking the door behind him. But as the bolt slid home, a new sound cut through the wind, a heavy, rhythmic thumping, distant but getting closer. Not a truck engine. Grant moved to the window. Through the blizzard he saw lights. Not headlights. Spotlights. Sweeping the trees. They weren't waiting for midnight. They were here now. And they hadn't come to talk. The blizzard didn't arrive. It collided with the mountain. By 2,100 hours, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet, a swirling vortex of white that erased the treeline and the sky. The wind howled at 40 miles per hour, screaming through the gaps in the logs, driving the temperature down into the single digits. Inside, Grant Holloway sat in the center of the main room, wrapped in layers of military-grade cold-weather gear. He had fortified his position with the grim efficiency of a man who had done this before in valleys far more hostile than this one. The windows were boarded shut with scrap lumber, leaving only narrow firing slits. The wood stove was banked low, providing just enough heat to keep his fingers dexterous without casting a silhouette. Koda lay at his feet, his body a warm, solid weight against Grant's boots. Every few minutes, the shepherd's ears would swivel toward the walls, tracking sounds that were lost to Grant in the roar of the wind. Grant checked his rifle for the 10th time. He didn't feel fear. He felt a cold, familiar detachment. The cabin wasn't a home anymore. It was a forward operating base. This wasn't Montana. It was just another deployment. Survive until extraction. At 22:30, Koda's head snapped up. A low, vibrating growl started deep in the dog's chest. He stood, moving stiff-legged toward the front door, his ears pinned forward. "Show me," Grant whispered. He moved to the front firing slit, raising his binoculars. The night vision phosphor green washed out the whiteout conditions, but he caught the heat signatures. 200 yards down the driveway, just at the edge of the clearing, vehicles had stopped. Through the swirling snow he saw them. 2 trucks, engines running. Men were disembarking. Grant counted 6, maybe 8 heat signatures. They fanned out with professional spacing, weapons held at the low ready. These weren't local meth heads or hired goons. They moved with tactical precision, using the terrain and the storm for cover. Grant reached for the police scanner he had tuned to the frequencies he'd intercepted earlier. Static hissed, then a voice cut through, accented and calm. "All units, this is Victor. Target is inside the cabin. Confirmed armed and trained. Approach with caution." There was a pause, filled only by the wind. "The boss wants him alive for questioning. But if necessary, eliminate the threat. Victor Sobel." The name carried the weight of a wet stone. The accent was unmistakable, Russian. Spetsnaz or something close to it. This was the cleaner. A moment later, a distorted voice boomed from the treeline, amplified by a loudspeaker. "Mr. Holloway." The sound was surreal, ghostly in the blizzard. "I know you can hear me. We have a simple proposition. Walk out with your hands visible and you will live through this night. Force us to come in, and we will burn that cabin down around you." Grant didn't move. He didn't speak. In the silence of the cabin, he controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate. Silence was its own answer. It was the answer of a man who was already digging in. "You can't win this." Victor's voice cracked with frustration against the wind. "You are outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. Be smart." Grant adjusted the elevation on his scope. Still nothing. "Fine," Victor snarled, the loudspeaker clicking off. "We do this the hard way." The first assault came at 2,300. Grant's perimeter alarms, the simple cans and pebbles he'd rigged, were useless in the wind, but Koda was better than any tripwire. The dog barked sharply, lunging toward the front left corner. Grant shifted positions, looking through a knot he'd punched out of the wood. 3 shadows were moving toward the porch, using the snowdrifts for cover in a standard military flanking maneuver. Grant didn't shoot to kill. Not yet. He lined up his sights on the porch railing inches from the lead man's head and squeezed the trigger. Crack thump. The wood splintered violently. The lead man dove into the snow. Grant fired a second shot, taking a chunk out of the support post. "I see you. I'm armed. I'm trained." The team scrambled back, retreating into the whiteout. They hadn't expected precision fire and zero visibility. But Grant didn't have time to celebrate. Koda spun around, barking furiously at the rear of the cabin. A diversion. Grant pivoted, sliding across the floor to the back window. He didn't wait to see a target. He trusted the dog. He fired 2 rounds blindly through the boarded-up window, aiming waist-high. A scream tore through the storm. "Man down." "Leg hit," a voice shouted from the darkness behind the cabin. Grant racked the bolt. "Get some," he whispered. He heard the sound of a body being dragged through the snow. Then silence returned. First blood was drawn. The syndicate now knew this wouldn't be an execution. It would be a war. The radio crackled again. "Forget the soft approach," Victor commanded, his voice cold. "We surround. We wait. We take the first opportunity." They shifted to siege tactics. For the next 4 hours, the night became a blur of probing attacks and psychological terror. They fired randomly into the walls, bullets punching through the dry timber and thumping into the far side of the room. Grant stayed low, crawling across the floor, conserving his ammunition. Every time he closed his eyes, the gunfire transported him back. The smell of pine became the smell of burning trash in Kandahar. The wind became the scream of incoming mortars. His hands shook, the tremors of PTSD threatening to unseat his grip on the rifle. But every time the darkness encroached, a wet nose nudged his hand. Koda was there, grounding him, pulling him back from the edge of the flashback to the reality of the fight. By 02:30 the shooting stopped. The silence was heavier than the gunfire. The wind howled, rattling the loose boards, but the enemy was quiet. Grant knew this tactic. It was the lull. They wanted him to relax, to think they had pulled back to regroup. Grant checked his ammunition. He was low. He checked Koda. The dog was exhausted, panting softly, but his eyes were wide open. "Stay with me, buddy," Grant whispered. Then, at 0300, the smell hit him. It cut through the scent of old dust and gun smoke. Sure. Chemical. Gasoline. Someone had crawled up to the foundation during the lull. They were pouring accelerant around the base of the cabin. The radio hissed. "Fire when ready. Smoke him out." Grant looked at the wooden walls. They were old, dry as kindling. Once it started, the cabin would be an inferno in minutes. He had seconds to act. "Time to go, boy," Grant said, his voice steady. He grabbed his go bag and moved to the fireplace. He threw aside the rug covering the hatch and yanked it open. The dark mouth of the fallout shelter yawned up at him. But he didn't go down. Instead, Grant pulled a flashbang grenade from his vest, one of the 3 he had saved. He pulled the pin, wrapped the spoon with a length of duct tape, and stuck it to the underside of the hatch lid. He rigged a tripwire from the hatch handle to the tape. If anyone opened this hatch or if the fire burned through the tape, boom. "Come," Grant signaled. He didn't head for the shelter. He headed for the small, unboarded window on the north side of the cabin. The side facing the cliff, the side they would least expect him to exit because it led nowhere. Or so they thought. Grant boosted Koda through the window, then vaulted out after him, landing in a snowdrift that came up to his waist. As they hit the ground, a whoosh sound erupted from the front of the cabin. A flare had been thrown. The gasoline ignited. Orange light exploded against the white snow, blindingly bright. The flames raced up the walls, licking at the roof. Grant and Koda scrambled on their bellies, clawing through the deep snow, using the blinding glare of the fire to mask their movement into the shadows of the cliff face. They reached the cluster of boulders 200 yards away just as the roof of the cabin began to groan. From inside the burning structure, a muffled bang echoed, the flashbang in the hatch going off, followed by the blinding white strobes visible even through the flames. Grant dove into the concealed entrance of the secondary tunnel, dragging Koda in behind him. He collapsed against the cold dirt wall of the tunnel, gasping for air, listening to the muffled roar of the fire above and behind them. He pulled the scanner from his pocket one last time. "We're moving in," Victor's voice shouted. "I want a body." Minutes passed. The fire raged. "Report," Victor screamed. "Nothing, sir. The floor is gone. The hatch is blown open. It's a furnace in here. We can't find a body. Keep searching." He couldn't have gotten far in this storm. Grant sat in the dark, damp silence of the tunnel, the smell of wet earth filling his lungs. A grim, bloodied smile cut across his face. They thought he was dead. They thought he was a charred corpse buried under the rubble of his $50 mistake. They thought the game was over. Grant checked the action on his rifle and patted Koda's head. The dog didn't whine, he was ready. Grant wasn't trapped in a hole. He was behind enemy lines, invisible and beneath their very feet. The syndicate had come to hunt a victim, but as Grant turned toward the darkness leading back to the shelter, he knew the truth. Victor Sobel was about to learn that the hunter had just become the hunted. Grant has vanished into the earth, but he's not alone down there. The victims are still in the shelter, unaware that the building above them is burning, and that their captors are about to descend into the very trap Grant has set. Can Grant navigate the collapsing tunnels to save them before Victor realizes the truth? Or will the fire consume them all? The storm raged overhead, a muffled, distant roar that vibrated through the 20 feet of earth and concrete separating Grant from the surface. Down here, in the cold, stale air of the fallout shelter, it was 0600 hours. Grant sat with his back against the supply shelf, cleaning the soot from his rifle action. He had been underground for 3 hours. He had treated the laceration on his forehead, fed Koda a strip of jerky, and taken stock of his ammunition. He had enough for a skirmish but not a war. The police scanner, now sitting on the dusty floor, crackled to life. "Boss is not happy," a static-laced voice cut through the silence. "He wants confirmation of the body or the target located within the hour." Victor's voice responded, sounding breathless and angry. "We are searching. The cabin is a pile of ash. The storm is making it impossible to see your hand in front of your face." Then a third voice broke in, smooth, cultured, and utterly ruthless. "Silas Blackwood. I don't care about excuses, Victor. That veteran has evidence that can destroy us. Find him. Or don't bother coming back." Grant checked his watch. 6:05 a.m. He stared at the glowing digits. He was supposed to call Maria with an all-clear at 0600. He hadn't made the call. A grim, bloodied smile cut across his face. Right now, miles away on a highway, Maria was handing that packet of evidence to the FBI. The clock had run out for the Shepherd Syndicate. Even if Grant died in this concrete box, the truth was already free. The mission was successful. Now it was just about survival. Suddenly, a sound drifted down the corridor, faint, rhythmic, and terrifyingly human. It wasn't coming from the hatch above. It was coming from deeper in the shelter, past the main supply room, down a corridor Grant hadn't fully explored in his initial recon. He signaled Koda. They moved silently, weapons raised, toward a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. The padlock on the outside was new. Grant used the bolt cutters from the tool wall, snapping the shank with a sharp crack. He threw the door open, flashlight beams slicing the darkness. 7 pairs of eyes stared back at him. Grant lowered his rifle, the breath leaving his lungs in a rush. They were huddled together on dirty mattresses, 7 people. A young woman clutching an infant against her chest. 3 teenagers. An elderly man wheezing in the corner. They were the shipment. The storm had delayed the transfer, and in the chaos of the fire and the siege, the syndicate had left them here to rot. Terror filled the room. The teenagers scrambled back against the wall. The young woman shielded the baby. "Please," Grant whispered, raising his hands. "I'm not with them." A girl with dark, frightened eyes stepped forward. She looked exactly like Maria. "You," she stammered in broken English. She looked at Koda, who was standing calmly at Grant's side, tail wagging slowly. "Maria," she said, "a man with a wolf dog." "Sophia?" Grant asked. The girl nodded, tears spilling over. "Is Maria safe?" "She's safe," Grant said, his voice thick with emotion. "She got away. She sent help. I'm here to get you all out." The tension in the room broke. Sophia hugged her cousin Carlos. The young woman, Elena, began to weep softly. But Grant didn't have time for relief. "Listen to me," he said, his voice hardening into command tones. "We are in a bad situation. The men upstairs are looking for us. How many are left?" Elena wiped her eyes. "The Russian. Victor. He arrived yesterday. He had 8 men. But I heard the guards talking. They said the veteran killed 2. 6, Grant muttered. Plus Victor." He looked at the group. They were weak, dehydrated, and terrified. He couldn't move them through the secondary tunnel and out into a blizzard with wind chills of 30 below. They would die of exposure in an hour. "We stay here," Grant decided. "We hold the fort." He moved them back into the deepest part of the shelter, behind the heavy steel door. "Lock this from the inside," he instructed Carlos. "Do not open it unless you hear my voice or the police." Grant returned to the main chamber, the room directly below the hatch. This was the kill zone. He overturned the heavy metal table to create a barricade facing the ladder. He positioned spare mattresses to absorb ricochets. He was turning a tomb into a fortress. Above, the radio crackled again. Victor's voice was desperate now. "We found the tunnel," the Russian shouted. "The rats are underground. All units converge on the hatch. We go in." "The victims?" another voice asked. "Priority is the veteran," Victor snarled. "If the others are in the way, eliminate them. No witnesses." Grant checked the magazine of his rifle. He looked at Koda. "For my squad," he whispered, the old mantra rising unbidden. "For these people. Not one more." Boom. The hatch above exploded inward, the breaching charge sending a shower of sparks and debris raining down into the chamber. Grant didn't flinch. He was behind the overturned table, rifle shouldered. A figure dropped through the smoke, sliding down the ladder rails. Grant waited until boots hit the concrete. Crack. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man crumpled. "Contact front." Grant yelled, the roar of combat taking over. A second man dropped, firing a submachine gun blindly as he descended. Bullets sparked off the concrete walls, whining like angry hornets. Grant tucked tight, letting the spray pass, then popped up. Crack. The second man spun, clutching his shoulder, and retreated up the ladder. Suppressing fire. Victor screamed from above. Automatic gunfire poured through the open hatch, chewing up the mattresses and pinging off the metal table. The noise was absolute, a physical pressure that hammered against Grant's eardrums. Holloway. Victor's voice echoed down the shaft during a reload. You are trapped in a grave. We control the only exit. Grant grabbed a flashbang he had recovered from the supplies. You're wrong, he shouted back. This shelter has 2 exits. And the FBI is already on the way. He threw the flashbang up the shaft. Bang. Screams of pain and confusion drifted down. You're lying. Victor yelled, but his voice wavered. Am I? Grant shouted. Where do you think the girl who escaped went? You think she's hiding in the woods? She's with the feds right now. Every minute you stay here is a minute closer to life in prison. Silence. Grant could hear them arguing above. I didn't sign up for this, one man hissed. He said the feds are coming. The girl? Shut up. Victor roared. We finished this. But the doubt was planted. Grant had bought time. Then the gunfire started again, heavier this time. They were firing in coordinated bursts, pinning him down. The enclosed space magnified the sound 100 times. The smell of cordite filled the air, thick and acrid. Grant flinched. The smell. The noise. The trapped sensation. Suddenly, the concrete walls weren't a shelter in Montana. They were the mud walls of a compound in the Korangal. The tracers were coming from the ridge. His squad was screaming. Grant froze. His finger locked on the trigger guard. His vision tunneled, the edges turning gray. He was back there. He was dying there. Move, his brain screamed. Move or die. But his body wouldn't obey. The PTSD had him in a chokehold. Through the haze he saw boots hit the floor. 2 men dropped into the room, moving tactically. They saw him frozen behind the barricade. One raised a shotgun. Koda launched. The dog came from the shadows like a cruise missile, 90 pounds of muscle and fury. He hit the lead attacker in the chest, driving him back into the wall with a sickening crunch. The second man panicked, swinging his weapon toward the dog. Koda's bark, a feral, savage sound, shattered Grant's paralysis. The anchor held. The reality of the dog in danger snapped the soldier back into the driver's seat. Grant surged up, the rifle becoming an extension of his will. Bang bang. Double tap. The second man dropped. Grant vaulted the table, pistol drawn, as Koda released the first man's arm. The attacker was scrabbling for his fallen shotgun. Grant kicked it away and leveled the pistol. Stay down, he commanded. The man froze, looking at the dead operative, then at the snarling dog, then at the veteran with the dead eyes. He raised his hands. I surrender, he gasped. Grant zip-tied him to the ladder supports in seconds. Silence returned to the chamber, heavy and ringing. Grant leaned against the wall, chest heaving. Koda trotted over, nudging his hand. Grant checked the dog. No blood. Safe. Good boy, Grant breathed, his forehead resting against the cool concrete. Good boy. From the top of the hatch, a slow clapping sound echoed. Very good, soldier, Victor called out. His voice was calm now, devoid of the earlier panic. It was the calm of a man who realized he had no way out but through. You have beaten my men. You have beaten the clock. Give it up, Victor, Grant called back. It's over. For me? Perhaps, Victor said. But I have 1 man left, and I have plenty of explosives. If I cannot have the witnesses, neither can you. Grant went cold. Last chance, Holloway, Victor's voice drifted down, metallic and final. Walk away. Leave the victims. I will disappear and you will survive. Grant looked at the heavy steel door behind him, where 7 innocent people were huddled in the dark. He looked at Koda. He looked at the ladder. I'm done walking away from things, Grant said, racking the slide of his pistol. Come and get me. Above him, the sound of a timer beeped. Bip, bip, bip. Victor wasn't coming down to fight. He was bringing the whole mountain down on top of them. Grant stood at the mouth of the secondary tunnel, the jagged hole in the concrete looking less like an escape route and more like a throat waiting to swallow them whole. Behind him, the main chamber was a ruin of bullet-pocked concrete and overturned furniture. Above, the beeping of Victor's timer was a relentless countdown to extinction. Go, Grant barked, shoving Carlos toward the dark opening. Move. Don't stop until you see the sky. The teenagers scrambled into the crawlspace, dragging the elderly man and the sobbing mother between them. Sophia looked back, her eyes wide with terror. Go! Grant roared. Only Koda remained. The German shepherd stood planted between Grant and the tunnel, whining low in his throat. His ears flicked back and forth, torn between the biological imperative of survival and the drilled instinct of loyalty. To leave his handler was to break the most fundamental law of his existence. Grant dropped to one knee, gripping the dog's ruff with blood-slicked hands. He looked into the amber eyes that had watched over him while he slept in the mud of the Pesh Valley, the eyes that had seen him at his broken worst and loved him anyway. "Koda, escort," Grant commanded, his voice cracking. He pointed into the blackness. "They need you. Go." Koda didn't move. He nudged Grant's hand, a desperate plea to stay and fight together. Grant shoved the dog harder than he ever had in his life. "Get out of here. Go." The harshness broke the spell. Koda looked back one last time, a look of profound betrayal and understanding, then turned and vanished into the darkness to protect the flock. Grant was alone. He stood up, the silence of the tunnel instantly replaced by the oppressive weight of the inevitable. He wasn't planning to survive this. He was planning to make sure the bill was paid in full. He turned back toward the junction point where the corridor met the main chamber. He grabbed a portable propane canister from the emergency supplies, the kind used for camping stoves, and wedged it into a pile of rubble near the doorway. He stepped back 10 paces, raised his pistol, and fired a single round into the valve. Gas hissed out, invisible and deadly, filling the narrow choke point with the smell of rotten eggs. Grant holstered the pistol and pulled a road flare from his vest. He stood in the center of the room, listening. Heavy boots crunched on the debris. Shadows stretched long and distorted against the walls. 2 figures emerged from the gloom of the main chamber, looking like insectoid monsters in their full-face gas masks. They carried demolition charges wired to a central detonator. Victor Sobel led the way. He stopped when he saw Grant standing alone, the flare unlit in his hand. The Russian scanned the room, his masked head swiveling to the empty corner where the victims had been hiding. "Where are they?" Victor's voice was muffled by the mask, sounding hollow and metallic. Grant popped the cap on the flare. It sparked and hissed to life, bathing the room in a hellish red glow. "Gone?" Grant said. "And you're not following." Victor's eyes widened behind the glass lenses as he realized what the hissing sound was. Grant threw the flare. The red light arched through the air and landed in the cloud of propane. It wasn't a Hollywood explosion. It was a violent, atmospheric heave. A wall of fire erupted in the corridor, consuming the oxygen in a terrifying whoosh. The shockwave slammed Grant backward into the concrete wall, knocking the wind out of him. Victor and his operative were thrown off their feet, engulfed in the flash fire. But the gas burned off in seconds, leaving behind scorching heat and smoke. Through the haze, a figure charged. Victor Sobel, his tactical vest singed and smoking, roared with a primal rage. He crashed into Grant before the ranger could raise his weapon. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. The firearm fight was over. This was a brawl in the dirt. Victor was bigger, stronger, and fueled by the fury of a man who watched his escape route vanish. He rained blows down on Grant's face, heavy, piston-like punches that cracked bone. Grant took the hits, tasting copper. His vision swam. He didn't try to match the Russian's strength. He used the room. As Victor reared back for a killing blow, Grant drove his knee into the man's groin, then twisted, slamming Victor's head into the exposed rebar jutting from the damaged wall. Victor grunted, his mask cracking, but he didn't let go. He wrapped his hands around Grant's throat, squeezing. Across the room, the second operative stumbled to his feet. He was burned, coughing violently as he ripped off his melted mask. He didn't join the fight. He moved to the demolition pack they had dropped. He punched a code into the detonator. The red timer flared to life. 0:30. 30 seconds to bury the evidence. 30 seconds to erase the shelter, the tunnel, and the crimes. Grant's vision was tunneling. Black spots danced in the red light. He scrabbled for his holster, but Victor had his arm pinned. Grant bucked his hips, dislodging the Russian just enough to free his right hand. He didn't aim for Victor. He aimed past him. Bang. The operative crumpled over the bomb, dead before he hit the floor. Victor roared, snatching Grant's wrist and slamming it against the concrete until the gun skittered away. He drove his forehead into Grant's nose, a brutal headbutt that shattered cartilage. "We die together, soldier." Victor snarled, blood spraying from his broken mask. "No witnesses." Grant looked at the timer. 0:12. He looked at the structural support beam directly above them, the main load-bearing pillar for the fallout shelter's roof. Grant reached into his vest and pulled the pin on his last fragmentation grenade. Victor saw it and laughed, a wet, gurgling sound. You kill us both anyway. No, Grant wheezed, jamming the grenade not at Victor but into the crack in the support beam. You die. I survive. Grant kicked Victor in the chest, creating just enough separation to roll away. He threw himself toward the jagged mouth of the secondary tunnel. 003. Victor lunged for the grenade, realizing too late what Grant had done. Boom. The grenade detonated. It wasn't the massive earth-shattering blast of the demolition charge, but it was precise. It sheared the steel reinforcement inside the pillar. The ceiling groaned, a sound like the earth tearing apart. Grant dove into the narrow tunnel just as the world behind him collapsed. The main chamber imploded. Hundreds of tons of rock, soil, and the burning ruins of the cabin above came crashing down. The impact was cataclysmic. It buried Victor Sobel. It buried the operative. And it buried the main demolition charge just as the timer hit 0. A split second later, the big bomb went off. The shockwave lifted Grant off the ground and slammed him against the tunnel roof. Dust filled his lungs like powdered glass. The roar was absolute, erasing all thought, all sound, all light. Then silence. Grant lay in the dark, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. He coughed, the sound wet and ragged. He reached back. His hand met a wall of loose rubble and twisted metal. The entrance to the shelter was gone. Sealed tight. He clicked his tactical light. The beam cut through the choking dust, illuminating only a few feet of the shored-up tunnel. He was alive. He was on the safe side of the collapse. But as the dust began to settle, Grant noticed something that made his blood run cold. The wooden timbers shoring up the tunnel roof were splintered from the shockwave. And from the darkness ahead, the way out, came the ominous, shifting sound of earth giving way. The exit was blocked. Grant was alive, but he was buried in a coffin of his own making, and the air was already beginning to taste stale. He reached for his radio to call for Koda, to call for anyone, but the device was smashed, the screen a spiderweb of cracks. He was alone in the dark, miles from help, with the weight of a mountain pressing down on his chest. And then, from the other side of the rubble wall, he heard a sound that shouldn't be there. Not the settling of rocks. Not the hiss of gas. A tapping. Clink, clink, clink. Someone else had survived the collapse, and they were digging toward him. The tapping became a frantic scratching. Grant lay on his stomach in the suffocating darkness of the tunnel, the air thin and tasting of pulverized concrete. The structural timbers above him groaned, settling under the weight of the collapsed mountain. He couldn't move forward. The exit was blocked by a wall of loose scree and snow. Koda, he rasped, the name tearing at his throat. The scratching intensified on the other side of the blockage. A shaft of blinding white light pierced the gloom as a paw broke through the debris. Then a nose, wet and black, sniffing furiously. Grant didn't have the strength to dig, but Koda did. The dog was tearing at the blockage from the outside, whining with a pitch that cut straight to Grant's heart. Grant forced his battered body to move, clawing at the loose dirt, pulling himself inch by inch toward the light. His hand broke the surface. Instantly, a warm tongue licked his bloody knuckles. With one final, agonizing heave, Grant dragged himself out of the earth and collapsed onto the snow. He wasn't dead. He was in the boulder field, shielded from the wind. He rolled onto his back, gasping in air that felt like liquid ice. The blizzard had broken. The sky above was a bruised purple, torn open by shafts of brilliant, cold sunlight. The wind had died down to a whisper, leaving the world suspended in a strange, ringing silence. Koda was all over him, licking the blood from his face, checking him for wounds, vibrating with relief. "I'm okay, buddy," Grant wheezed, sitting up. "I'm okay." He looked toward the tree line. The victims, Sophia, Carlos, Elena, and the others, were huddled together in the snow, shivering violently. When they saw Grant emerge from the ground like a revenant, covered in gray dust and blood, they didn't look away. They looked at him as if he were a miracle carved from granite. "We have to move," Grant said, his voice a ruin. He used a boulder to pull himself upright. His left leg screamed in protest, and his ribs felt like shattered glass, but the adrenaline managed to override the pain one last time. "The road. We have to get to the road." They stumbled through the knee-deep drifts, a ragged procession of the lost and the found. Grant took point, rifle hanging uselessly from his shoulder, one hand resting on Koda's back for balance. They reached the main access road 10 minutes later. The snowplows hadn't come yet, but tire tracks cut through the fresh powder. Blue lights flashed in the distance. "Police!" Elena cried out, pointing with a frostbitten hand. They came. Grant squinted against the glare. An SUV was tearing up the road, fishtailing in the snow before skidding to a halt 20 yards away. It wasn't the state patrol. It was a black and white sheriff's department vehicle. Sheriff Marcus Gaines stepped out. He wasn't wearing his heavy winter coat. He was in his uniform, hand resting on the grip of his service weapon. 2 deputies spilled out of the passenger doors, shotguns raised. Gaines looked at the huddled group of shivering victims. Then he looked at Grant, battered, scorched, swaying on his feet. "Get on the ground," Gaines shouted, his voice cracking like a whip across the silent clearing. "On the ground. Now. We need help," Sophia screamed, stepping forward. "We are hurt." "I said get down." Gaines drew his pistol and leveled it at the girl. Grant shoved Sophia behind him. "It's over, Marcus," he yelled, the force of his voice surprising even him. "The shelter is gone. Victor is dead. The FBI knows." Gaines didn't lower the weapon. A cold, predatory smile touched his lips. "The FBI isn't here, Holloway. It's just us. And I'm looking at a domestic terrorist who just blew up a historic property and killed a bunch of illegal squatters." Grant went cold. Gaines wasn't here to arrest them. He was here to clean up the mess. He was going to execute them in the snow and blame it on the explosion. "You can't kill us all," Grant said, shifting his weight, preparing to charge even though he knew he'd never make the distance. "Not before I rip your throat out." "Watch me," Gaines said. He thumbed the hammer back. Grant tensed. Koda growled, sensing the intent, muscles coiling to launch. Thump, thump, thump. The sound started as a vibration in Grant's sternum. A rhythmic beating that shook the snow from the pine boughs. Gaines's eyes flicked upward. From the clearing mist behind the tree line, a dark shape rose. Then another. 260 Black Hawks banked sharply over the treetops, the wash from their rotors kicking up a blinding cloud of snow. They bore the bold yellow letters on their sides, FBI. Gaines froze. The lead helicopter hovered 50 feet above the road, its side door open. A sniper sat on the rail, rifle trained on the sheriff's chest. A high-intensity searchlight pinned Gaines to the spot, blinding him. An amplified voice boomed from the sky, shaking the earth. "Federal agents. Drop the weapon. Drop it now." Gaines looked at Grant. He looked at the helicopter. He looked at the vast, empty wilderness that had hidden his crimes for so long, now suddenly crowded with the eyes of judgment. The gun slipped from his fingers and disappeared into the snow. The Black Hawk touched down in the middle of the road, the landing gear sinking into the drift. Before the rotors even slowed, armed tactical agents poured out, swarming the sheriff and his deputies. Grant sank to his knees. His legs simply stopped working. Through the swirl of snow and rotor wash, a small figure jumped from the helicopter. She wasn't wearing tactical gear. She was wearing a borrowed, oversized FBI windbreaker. "That's him," Maria screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Grant. "That's the man. That's the man who saved us." She ran past the armed agents, past the handcuffed sheriff, and threw her arms around Sophia. The 2 sisters collapsed into the snow, sobbing, a tangle of grief and relief. Grant sat heavily on a tree stump as the adrenaline finally left his system. It didn't fade slowly, it crashed. His hands started to shake so violently he couldn't unclench his fists. His teeth chattered, shock setting in. Koda moved in. The dog didn't lick him or bark. He simply sat beside the stump and leaned his full 90 pounds against Grant's leg. The pressure was a physical anchor, a grounding technique that pulled Grant back from the edge of dissociation. "Ranger Holloway?" Grant looked up. A man in a windbreaker with FBI stenciled on the back stood over him. He was older, gray-haired, with the look of a man who had seen too much. "Agent Miller." "I'm Miller," the agent said. "We found the tunnel exit because of the coordinates the girl gave us. We have the rest of the ring in custody across state lines. We picked up Blackwood at the airport an hour ago." Grant nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was filled with glass. "It's over, Ranger," Miller said softly, putting a hand on Grant's shoulder. "You held the line." Medics were swarming the victims now, wrapping them in silver thermal blankets. Grant watched as Elena handed her baby to a paramedic. He watched Carlos helping the old man toward an ambulance. He closed his eyes. For 3 years, every breath he took had felt stolen, borrowed time that belonged to the men who died in the Korangal. He had lived in the shadow of his own survival. But as the cold mountain air filled his lungs, sharp and clean, it felt different. It didn't feel stolen. It felt earned. "We're good, Koda," Grant whispered, resting his hand on the dog's head. "We're good." But as the chaos of the rescue swirled around him, The radios chirping, the rotors spinning, the weeping of the survivors. Grant felt a new, unfamiliar silence opening up inside him. The war was over. The enemy was dead. The mission was complete. For a soldier who had known nothing but battle for 20 years, peace was the terrifying part. Grant looked at the ruins of the cabin, smoke still drifting lazily into the clear blue sky. He had destroyed the only home he had left. He was a hero to the world, but as he sat shivering on the stump, he realized he had absolutely nowhere to go. The handcuffs clicked shut on Sheriff Gaines's wrists, but Grant knew the hardest trial wasn't in a courtroom. It was figuring out how to live when you no longer had a reason to die. The fluorescent lights of the federal courtroom hummed with a frequency that grated against Grant Holloway's nerves. He stood in the witness box, his hand resting on the Bible, feeling like an imposter in his own skin. He was clean-shaven for the first time in years, wearing a charcoal suit bought off the rack that felt more restrictive than body armor. Across the aisle, Silas Blackwood sat at the defense table. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow, shrinking look of a man watching his empire dissolve. Next to him, separated by legal counsel, was former Sheriff Marcus Gaines. Gaines wouldn't look at Grant. He stared at the table, his wrists shackled to his waist. Grant's testimony was quiet, precise, and devastating. He recounted the discovery of the hatch, the logbook, the photographs, and the night of the siege. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke with the voices of the 17 victims recovered from the pipeline. The network wasn't just broken, it was annihilated. When the gavel finally fell, signaling the end of the session, Grant didn't wait for the congratulations of the prosecutors. He walked out the heavy oak doors and into a wall of flashing cameras. Mr. Holloway. Grant. Over here. How does it feel to be a hero? Is it true you fought off Russian special forces? Grant ignored them, his eyes fixed on the exit. The word hero tasted like ash. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had finally found a line he wouldn't cross. He pushed through the crowd, stepping out into the cold Montana sunshine. He walked straight to his battered Silverado parked at the curb. Inside, Koda was waiting. The dog didn't care about the suit or the cameras. He licked Grant's hand, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the seat. Grant rested his forehead against the dog's fur, taking a breath that finally reached the bottom of his lungs. "Let's go home, buddy," he whispered. But home was a complicated concept. 2 days later, Grant turned the truck onto the dirt road leading up the mountain. The yellow police tape had been removed, but the scars remained. The cabin was gone. In its place lay a blackened footprint of charred timber and ash, smelling of wet charcoal. The entrance to the fallout shelter, the mouth of the beast, had been filled with concrete by federal contractors, sealed forever under a gray slab that looked like a tombstone. It looked desolate. It looked dead. Grant stood by the ruins, his hands in his pockets, the wind whipping his jacket. He had destroyed the evil, but he had destroyed his sanctuary in the process. The crunch of gravel behind him broke the silence. A pickup truck with Abernathy hardware stenciled on the door pulled into the clearing. The old man, Abernathy, climbed out. He looked older than he had 3 weeks ago, worn down by the weight of a collective shame. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his hands. "Heard you were coming back," Abernathy said, his voice rough. Grant watched him, saying nothing. "Town had a meeting last night," the old man continued, looking at the blackened ground rather than Grant's eyes. We know we looked the other way for too long. We let fear make us complicit. We can't undo that." He looked up, meeting Grant's gaze with a desperate determination. "But we want to help you clear this. The debris, the hauling, the lumber. We want to do it for free. If you'll let us." Grant looked at the old man, then at the sealed bunker, and finally at the sweeping view of the valley below. He had come here to hide. He had come here to die. But standing in the wreckage, he realized the fire hadn't just burned the cabin. It had burned away the rot. Grant nodded slowly. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I'm building." 6 months later, the smell of ash was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh pine sawdust. A new frame stood in the clearing. It wasn't a fortress. It wasn't a dark, defensive box designed to keep the world out. It had a wide, wraparound deck and massive roughouts for windows facing south, designed to catch the light. Grant was kneeling on the deck, driving screws into the cedar planks, when he heard a car approach. He stood, wiping sweat from his forehead. It was a sedan with government plates, but the people getting out weren't feds. Maria Hernandez stepped out of the car. She looked different, healthy, her cheeks flushed with color, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a cautious optimism. Sofia and Carlos were with her. They had been granted special visas for their testimony, a new start in a new country. Maria ran up the steps and hugged Grant, burying her face in his flannel shirt. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. She pulled a piece of paper from her bag and handed it to him. It was a drawing, done in colored pencil. It echoed the crude scratches he had found on the shelter wall, but this one was vibrant. It showed a house with big windows, a bright yellow sun, and standing in front of it, a man and a large, dark dog. Grant swallowed the lump in his throat. He pinned the drawing to a stud in the wall, the first decoration of the new house. As the family walked around the property, marveling at the view, Agent Miller stepped onto the porch. "You've done good work here, Grant," Miller said, leaning against the railing. "It's getting there," Grant replied. "The Bureau is impressed," Miller said, cutting to the chase. "We need people with your skill set. Consultants who understand tactical tracking and sensitive victim recovery. There's a job for you in D.C. if you want it. Good pay. A badge." Grant looked at Miller, then at Maria laughing with her sister in the meadow. He looked at the mountains, vast and indifferent and beautiful. "I appreciate the offer, Miller," Grant said. "But I have work to do here." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Building a house?" "Building a life," Grant corrected. He gestured to the open frame. "And I think I'm finally ready to sleep without a gun under my pillow." Miller smiled, shook Grant's hand and walked back to the car. As the vehicle drove away, leaving Grant alone in the silence, he reached into his tool belt and pulled out a fuzzy, bright yellow tennis ball. He whistled. Koda came trotting around the corner. The dog stopped, his amber eyes locking onto the ball. His ears were up, but not in alarm. His hackles were smooth. He wasn't searching for explosives. He wasn't hunting a threat. Grant threw the ball toward the tree line. "Get it?" Koda launched himself off the deck, paws scrabbling for traction, chasing the bouncing yellow dot with the pure, unadulterated joy of a puppy. He snagged it, tumbled in the grass and trotted back, tail wagging in a wide, lazy arc, tongue lolling out the side of his mouth. Grant knelt and rested his hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back. They said the cabin cost $50. They were wrong. It had cost him his old life. The one that was broken, the one that was afraid, the one that was waiting to die. Grant took the ball and smiled, looking out at the horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. "Best deal I ever made." He threw the ball again, watching it arc high into the blue sky, wondering what else was out there waiting to be found now that he had finally stopped running. "Look," Koda faced down armed mercenaries, sniffed out a hidden bunker, and nearly got buried alive under a mountain just to save his human. "He's a good boy. He's the best boy." Grant didn't walk away when it got hard. Don't you walk away without subscribing. Honor the fight. Like the video.